Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing whether the online regulation of content is warranted or if it's a form of censorship. Now, Professor Geist, I just wanted you to be able to wrap up the point you were making on your last, on the last segment about the differences between these 5 types of harm the government's outlined.
Yeah, I really was just to make the point that, these are hard issues, and the kinds of content that we're talking about, while they may be the same in the sense that there are legal rules around them, they are significantly different, I think, in terms of the kinds of ways we would want to be addressing them. And the government really hasn't, I think, given the kind of seriousness of thought to how you best go about dealing with each of these kinds of content.
Now, Mr. Goldberg, I want to give you a chance here to jump in. What are your main concerns with the federal proposal to regulate online content?
Well, first of all, as Professor Geist has so eloquently said in the past, we might be creating here a new bureaucratic superstructure with creating all these new review boards and tribunals and agencies to try to deal with this. We also have concerns about partiality here. This proposal would create a digital safety commission with a commissioner leading it, who would be appointed by the cabinet, and then a tribunal potentially dealing with what should or should not be taken down, all appointed by the Minister of Heritage. So you're looking at a bunch of people appointed by a partisan government, potentially ordering companies to take material down. And that's a deep concern if there's some material potentially that would, in some cases, be negative toward the government.
Yeah, so what the government has proposed is creating a new regulator, the Digital Safety Commissioner, and 2 other regulatory bodies. Actually, it's a huge new bureaucratic endeavor. Mr. Haradai, how do you respond to Jay's concerns he's raised about the partiality of the people who get committed to this new bureaucratic structure that are all going to be partisan selections, or at least have the potential to be partisan selections?
I share those concerns in part simply because we've seen at all levels of government, irrespective of which party, that these types of partisan appointments can and do happen. So it's not an unfounded concern, but as I pointed to earlier, that decisions that are made through bodies like this are subject to review, primarily by judges ultimately who are not elected, and there is a strong measure of independence. It doesn't mean that there aren't different perspectives by judges, but they are politically independent, and that is where many of us have some assurance, at least, that there will be a review process.
Now, Mr. Goldberg, you'd also raised concerns with some of the penalties. Can you outline for our viewers what the penalties are for failing to take down this content?
Yeah, absolutely. So failure to block certain content could lead to a fine of 3% of global revenue, or $10 million, whatever is higher. That's a heck of a lot of money. If you're looking at companies like Facebook and Twitter, that could be billions and billions of dollars. And so if there's that much on the table, then what you could potentially see is these companies realizing that there's this significant risk, not ever really challenging what the government is instructing them to take down, just because they'll be afraid of the magnitude of the fines here.
Now, Professor Geist, platforms already do have their own policies for removing content that would fall under these categories, and probably more content, since a lot of them have these community standards policies. How are those types of policies, these privately developed policies, working, and how effective are they at getting rid of this content?
Well, not well enough. And that's why I think this notion that we don't need rules is incorrect. I do think that we need rules. I think that part of the focus, the extent to which we are focusing specifically on the platforms, has to be on both more transparency in terms of what they do, more consistency in terms of how they apply those rules, because it often feels wildly inconsistent in the ways that they may apply them, and frankly, real accountability where they fail to do so. These companies should be held responsible where they hold out that this is the standards that they have, this is how they're going to enforce it. And when they fail to do so, there ought to be liability associated with that. That's quite different from the kind of plan that we see articulated by the government here, which, as we've been talking about, involves so much of this additional levels of bureaucracy and incentives to remove, as opposed to incentives to be transparent and accountable.
Now, Mr. Haradai, how do you feel about these penalties, and do you think that they're maybe over the top?
Well, I think, again, we're still looking at a discussion paper, not necessarily a bill, definitely not a law. So it is very, very speculative to say whether or not it will be disproportionate. What I would say is that administrative monetary penalties have in other contexts been very effective in modifying the way that private industry does business. And so I'm open to the suggestion. I don't think it's necessarily a door that's fully closed to me.
Okay, well, we will continue this conversation when we come back from these commercial messages.